Welcome back, everybody. My name is Samara Chadwick. I'm going to be Anna Serrano's proxy for moderating this panel. As I kind of hinted at in the last panel, I think this is a really nice kind of materialization of some of the threads that were being kind of like hinted at and kind of introduced at the Anti-Manifesto. This is a panel that is a lot about, I guess, ideology. These words, a lot of the words that we want to use around this panel are actually like really shitty, heavy, like words that kind of land with a thud and don't actually resonate with the kind of the life that we actually want to, oh God.
Good life, man.
That we actually want to infuse this conversation with. This is not like about ethics or representation or kind of like responsibility. It's like once we start charting things out in these dry ways, I think we lose kind of the magic of what it is we're actually trying to accomplish. I think that VR, as was discussed, especially by Liam, is this really interesting technology because it accelerates and amplifies a lot of conversations that we are just having in general in the world as creators. I work in documentary, so the intersection with the real is what is interesting to me when it comes to VR, is the R part, and how the V kind of heightens these conversations and these debates that are happening in the R. So this panel is one that I think like we're gonna do something a little new. It's a panel on breaking open our understanding of narrative and how we tell stories and who is telling stories. I think it's a conversation that's been happening in Canada, like really in the last couple of years. There's been a lot of effort to understand that there is kind of a genealogy to how we understand ourselves in this continent, how we relate to art and media and to story through kind of a certain lens. And it's not about guilt. This is about kind of just opening up that kind of expanding beyond the rigidity through which a lot of stories have been told in the past and how we have understood ourselves through art and through technology. So we just kind of want to like open it up. And we're also opening it up to the room. Please, as we did in the last panel, like feel free to interrupt at any time. We also have the live feed if people online want to send us
Questions? That's why I'm
interruption.
texting. I'm not trying to be rude, okay?
Tally's
So we will
gonna
take the questions from people watching at home.
Yeah, so I think to get us started, I'd love for you all to introduce yourselves, as we discussed, like introduce yourself, as a creator, what your background is, but also why, how you feel that your work and your efforts and your understanding of the work you do is charting new ground and kind of breaking away from certain patterns that you have identified as like troublesome. So do you want to start, Tally?
Oh, hi. I'm Tali. I've been doing VR for quite a while, since 2013. I've been a curator, a film producer, and an installation programmer for a long time in museums. Also a game producer now. And we have Steer to VR, do the possibilities of new language. And I'm very interested, again, in putting the human in the core of the experience and giving a spotlight and a voice to people that would not normally tell the stories that we broadly see in the mainstream. So I'm very interested in the new POVs and where we can give the stage to new ways of thinking through technology.
Hi, I'm Vladimir Ilic. I'm the art director for VR Nerds. VR Nerds is a content creation studio for immersive media, and we also run Germany's biggest immersive media website. In my work, I try to do as much work inside VR for VR, so the loop's close, where I like create stuff outside on a flat monitor, and then somehow magically it appears in VR. I really don't like that. I like to work in VR as much as possible, so the VR content is just not the output, so the content is also created inside VR.
My name is Tess Takahashi, and I'm an academic from the field of cinema and media studies. And I've been researching a book project that has to do with artists' engagements with historically new media. So it starts in the 1960s when media like film, which of course has been around for over 100 years, almost 100 years then, and video were new to artists. So the reason that they were new is because not that artists had access to 35 millimeter cameras or like big Hollywood sets, but that a lot of both 16 millimeter cameras and 8 millimeter cameras were being decommissioned. Like, just for example, there were a huge influx of punk films that started to get made in the 1970s and 80s because the mythology is that a big truckload of them, kind of a bunch of cameras like fell off the truck in New York City and the Lower East Side, and then people took these up. So, you know, this research project goes from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, and it doesn't include VR, but VR is one of the, you know, areas I'm researching now as a medium in which artists are engaged. And one of the things I'm most interested in is how the different directions that those engagements go. Like if you think about video in the 1970s, there were artists who used the medium as what was criticized as video narcissism, to kind of turn in on the self and away from the world and just engage with the self. And there were other artists who were engaging with the larger technologies of television and critiquing those things, using video as a medium through which they thought that they could talk back, or like in the early days of TV access, or cable access, which some of you may have been familiar with. Things were more open, and this work was actually on television, even if, you know, only their friends were watching it.
Hi, my name's... Oh, it will be. Try again.
Hi guys, my name's Naila Inukshuk, and I make VR 360 augmented reality content, sometimes do 2D stuff too. Essentially, I make content with the intention of telling stories and kind of shaping perspective. So whether or not that's something like an experiential project or a game, or if it's more scripted, documentary, narrative, cinematic stuff. So yeah, that's me.
Okay, there's a few words that you guys said that I wanted to kind of like follow up on. Also, please, if ever there's work you want to show, you know, let us know. We'll throw it up on the screen. The idea of like a new language. Does any of you want to speak about this idea? I think like what we've been working on. So all these people, we were all participating in this VRRV project. We've been spending the last 3 days together, 4 days. And I think a lot of the impetus for the VRRV project was around the idea that language was kind of that we don't have language, like that we're grappling to understand something that is beyond what we are able to describe. And so in order to both create an experience that is collective, language is useful because it allows that communication, but it also allows you to kind of have a frame of reference and also a frame of kind of, you know, these words that we don't want to use, like of ethics, or of to kind of understand the ideology. So it allows you to kind of operate perhaps more responsibly. Do any of you want to talk about language in that sense?
Well, I just know that it's kind of, because people come from different backgrounds and skill sets when they're working in VR. You can find someone that's really come from a film background or a strictly gaming background, or someone that's a journalist or a documentary filmmaker. And so there's also, just because the workflow is so different, and, you know, depending on what kind of content you're making, whether it's 360 or VR, you know, having to just learn another kind of language, and not to mention if you're going to actually like learn how to code or something like that. But even when you're just working with, if you come from the film background, working with game developers and really getting to know their language and vice versa, it's like I've worked with game designers that have been like, what do you mean you're a VR producer? What's like a producer do? And because there's so many things a producer could do in film, it's like clarifying those things. And they're like, oh, okay, so you're like a project manager. And then it's like those are things that is just kind of like a learning curve. But then there's also, of course, this other kind of set of language that we have to, like, it's hard for us to, like, I say, like, okay, I make cinematic VR content, but I sometimes do 2D. And then it's like, okay, what do you mean? Because you can have 360 content that's 2D 360 and 3D 360. So then it's like, oh, no, like flatties, like 16 by 9. So it's like also like just changing the way we talk about pre-existing content in kind of an interesting way.
I think what you said at the beginning is important too. Like, you're talking about genre, like, is this a game? Is it documentary? Is it a story? Is it some combination of those things? I often hear about VR just as VR, or just as a technology, as opposed to thinking about how the language operates. I mean, I was just in Beijing at the Beijing Film Academy, where they're doing a lot of exchanges with artists and moguls and academics from various places in the West. And like, one of the questions of language just had to do with translation. Like, we were having a big problem understanding each other. And I know here English is the language that we're working in, but of course we have Germans and French and Japanese and people from all different language backgrounds. So what I found myself thinking about a lot then was, what am I not understanding from these other people that's really important for me to understand, because we have these big gaps.
I think when I mentioned language, I was talking a little bit more abstractively. I think for sure we need a glossary when we're talking with people from different backgrounds. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the process of VR, or UX as I call now, because I've been in those spaces, so it's easier for me to transit. But I'm actually talking more about the language, the common language of VR, the common language inside the space of a room scale or interactive media that we are trying to define. So I think we are very closed-minded in trying to find right now rules, best practices, constraints, the way of telling those things that will become conventions, and how we break those conventions and how we do not opt into those initial conventions is what interests me and my studio right now. How new this is, and how we can take liberties to go further, to explore other media that we've been loving, like bringing other than trying to define this inside a box, where we have rules for telling the story, for representing visually, and things like that. One of the most interesting things is we have already a lot of technical constraint in VR. And constraint is good for creators. It gives us a initial framework, but why are we constraining ourselves with the experiences we are telling, with the POVs that we are choosing to use, and who we put in the core of the experience? So that's what I'm very interested in exploring, that language, what the experiential language will be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we kind of have to drop the notion of like, okay, this is a documentary maker, this is a coder, this is an artist, a creative person. Putting people into those boxes, burn those boxes. You don't need them in VR, because you have to create a reality. And it's like a coder alone creates his reality, where it's like, okay, this is all about the rules and this dedicated language that he's using. But he has to work together with a creative person and a producer together to create something that's coherent, that every human, it doesn't matter of background or which box he's put into, can enjoy or experience. So you have to wear so many hats, and those constraints are kind of okay, but you also have to look at how do you jump over those constraints and work collaboratively to create something coherent that everyone can enjoy.
There are actually so many interesting questions from the audience that were generated by the last panel that I'm wondering if people have things that are left over.
Please jump in at any time.
Jump in at any time.
We'll keep an eye out for you guys. I did want to. Yeah. Oh, there's one. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to comment maybe on the title that you guys use, Stories We Sell, which probably relates to the movie by Sarah Polley, Stories We Tell. And at the beginning of that movie, there's a little quote by Margaret Atwood that says that stories actually doesn't feel like a story when it is actually being experienced. It's only afterwards, when we tell it to someone or to ourselves, that it becomes something that sounds like a story, or has a structure, or follows like Aristotle's poetic dramatic structure. And I'm just wondering, because I see like Google's VR director Jessica Brillard like struggling with like the montage and editing techniques for VR, and I'm just thinking that maybe it's something that we can't really escape as humans, like living temporal experiences, and it's something that's just like maybe we don't need to think so hard about it, and maybe we don't think to need to try to fit like the rules of dramaturgy, because those are basically just are being established in literature and are being like reified as something like very stiff. And making a parallel between like Margaret Atwood's description of stories being experienced. There's the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio that defines core consciousness on any organism as like silent narratives. So basically, consciousness begins when an organism starts to tell itself a story of what's being monitored. And maybe that could just like ease out the pressure of trying so hard to conform to literature defined like narrative structures. That was just my comment.
I thought that is so interesting, and that's absolutely kind of like spot on, I think, with in the difference between literature and film, and it is that we can't kind of stick to these traditions and these kind of rules that we've established for different mediums, and that require these certain things like 3 acts, and also that linear storytelling, and because it is really about the experience in VR, and so when I talk to some people in film, and they're just like, well, how do you without the close-up, how are you kind of seeing what how are you supposed to know how you're feeling about things, and like really kind of can't get past that, and then also like needing and I mean, people still like use cuts and edits, and it's really trying to figure out how can we create this experience without having to kind of rely on these tools that are really good for one medium, and maybe don't make sense for VR. And when when I get people talking about, just naturally, because it's an interesting place to work, a lot of people are like, oh, I know a really good VR idea, or I've got this script that I've been working on, and I think it would be great if you could make it in 360. And the thing for me is that it's the first thing when I'm thinking about a project is like, why VR? And I might just be like a really big critic of the medium, despite like working in it, because a lot of things shouldn't be made in 360, and I think you have to ask, okay, what is this the best version for this story? Is it going to be in 360, or is it like really the best way to tell it is on 360, and on 2D it just wouldn't be doing it justice, or in a short story, it wouldn't be doing it justice, and then that's when it's interesting. Because if you can do it in 2D, do it in 2D. It's like much more accessible, and it works, and we've already figured that out.
Well, one of the things that I keep noticing about the language of VR is how similar it is to the language of early cinema. I mean, the language of early cinema is like, it's just one shot, it's far away, you look around the screen, and There are no cuts, there are no close-ups, there's very little direction in the camera. And part of that had to do with people being nauseated or being disoriented when they first encountered the medium of cinema, in the same way that people talk about being nauseated or disoriented if there are too many cuts or too much jumping around in VR. A lot of it had to do with comfort. So part of it makes me think like, okay, it's a long history of cinema, and that language has developed slowly over time, and people have gotten used to it slowly over time and gotten comfortable. Like, you don't feel disoriented now when you see like a shot of one person looking at something and then you see the thing. Like, that would have been like, oh my God, like that would have really messed up the audience then. So part of it, I think, is just a matter of like the slow development of the language.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned also like the technical aspects, like cuts in VR. It's also a big issue. Right now, if you watch an action movie, like you have a cut every 2 seconds. Show that to a person like 20, 30 years ago, and they would be like, they wouldn't.
They would be sick.
Exactly, and that's one of the thing, like people who come from traditional media, like 2D cinema and stuff like that. They superimpose those things onto VR, but in VR you really need to like kind of take a few more steps back and create not a linear story, but when you're trying to tell a very good story in VR, you're not creating this linear experience. You're creating like a context where a story can happen. It's like that's why I also don't use the term storytelling. You're not creating a story, you're creating the context for a story to happen. To like look at VR chat, there's so many great stories happening right there, even right now, and they just naturally arise from the context the world creators there have created.
I love this as like contextual narratives. I think I will start calling my work that. Thank you.
Exactly.
It's awesome. I was thinking, one of the things I wanted to bring up, when we say stories we sell, I was thinking about we are selling headsets with our content. We are selling a new idea of that you need this new medium to enhance your experience in this world. We are selling and pitching our own ideas. We are selling our POV. We are selling so much when we are trying to do VR. So easy to get lost in what the hell are you really selling? Are you really selling a narrative now? Are you really trying to provide an experience or a thesis or a subject so other people can experience what you're trying to say? So that's very interesting to me, and makes me want to tap into the control. And I think us as creators have been so on control on the media we had so far. We had years of experience reading, of cinematography, on literature, on spatialized theater. We have so much control, and I'm having this dispute with a professor at Concordia the other day, and he's a very awesome filmmaker, and he's like, I hate VR, I have no frame. And I was like, you mean you have no power? And he was like, what you're trying to say to me? And I was like, the moment you take your cut away, the moment that you take your framing away, I'm taking away your power of infusing that story with your sole point of view. Now you have another person that's looking around that might not give a fucking damn about what you want to show them. Well, and right, so how do we as creators can work with the abandonment of this new experiential contextual thing where we are not the only ones telling that story?
A friend of mine was talking about showing her students a VR piece for the first time, and the student, having been in this cinema studies environment, said, oh, this is so interesting, it eliminates the male gaze, or like it eliminates the gaze of the director. And my friend was really excited about this, but I was like, but there are also certain things within VR too that direct us, right? We might be directed by light, or we might be directed by sound, like where that is in the space. Like, you know, like in making VR, that maybe there's not one ideal point of view that's directing your attention, but there's a range of ideal points of view.
And someone's creating the perspective that you're experiencing, and they're, you know, placing objects or people as objects like within this space around you. And the thing about VR that's different than other forms of medium is that you're not passively watching experiences on television. And seeing these as like these people in this place. You're having to ask yourself when you're watching, like, who am I? Where am I? And it's so that kind of perspective is something that has been chosen for you, and I think that's really important when we're kind of, because the fact is there's a lot of men working in tech, and it's not like the most diverse place, and we have these kind of narrative stories or contextualized narratives, but these especially with documentary and these like empathy docs and things like that, where, you know, it's this is what we're looking at and this is how we're going to feel about it, and we're supposed to feel empathy for the most part marginalized voices, brown faces, and so it's I think when we're talking about gaze, the implications are actually even more impactful.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned like also like the passivity. It's like in traditional 2D media, like you only have this like passive experience that was controlled by the frame, and you are kind of forced throughout the whole experience. You didn't even notice it, that you were like kind of forced through the story basically, because there was no way to interact with the story. You could interact with the story if you played interactive media like video games, but that added a whole new level of that opened a whole new can of worms basically, because you could now kind of control different aspects of how you experience the story. If you have like the aspect of interactivity in it, that you kind of have to in VR, because even the gaze control, that's interactivity because you're controlling the frame. That's one aspect of interactivity. Then you have controls with your hands basically. If you look at the creation tools, you have this weird motion where you open and close your hands, and it's like you're scaling the world up and down. You're making it bigger and smaller. It's not just fun and giggle and stuff like that. It's a huge responsibility to create good content, good narrative content in VR, because you're basically you're changing the human brain in a massive way. Because you're teaching new elements that you couldn't do before in this standard reality, but your brain doesn't know the difference. If I dream, if I go to sleep, I scale my dreams up and down. I make them bigger and smaller because I spend like hundreds of hours inside VR creating in VR. And it's like my brain learned I can make this smaller or bigger, louder or quieter. And it's like learned behaviors. And it's not just, okay, well, you can make cool stuff and tell cool stories. You're changing the human brain and psyche, basically.
I was thinking a lot about what people were saying about wanting to, see what other people in other countries or other cultures are doing in VR. And somebody, I forget who it was, mentioned giving VR tools to an indigenous community in Africa and seeing what they come up with. And I'm like, who is that for, right? That's a question that we often ask in documentary. It's like, this is another example of a student talking about VR and being like, oh, it'll allow a white person to see what it's like to be a black person. And I was like, oh my God, it's like, yeah, but it's like, who is it for? Is the documentary for somebody else? Is the documentary for the community in which the person is a part? Who?
And what
who
are we
is making
selling?
and who
like
is for.
also,
Yeah.
That's why I was asking about the point of view. I think the point of view and who is actually in the center of those stories starts to be more relevant. When we were having also a discussion in the academia world, talking about how people were perceiving VR as very egocentric and very very centered on the self. And then I made a provocation, and they're like, but we don't need to talk about self anymore. We've been talking about self in centuries. And I was like, really? You white male? Maybe there are other people that could benefit to be able to tell stories from the self that were not the main storytellers that we've been consuming for ages. So it's a very important as well to see who we give that megaphone to.
I think it's also interesting because I do some work going to indigenous communities and bringing cameras and headsets and stuff like that. But in the end, and I think it is really important for, especially because there seems to be people that want to watch content about indigenous communities in VR, and I think it's important to have these, if that's something that we're going to be doing, that have these communities represented by themselves and have a voice that they can share, not just because it's important for representation, but but this is something I struggle with all the time. Is that when we're making content, of course, it's going to be, for the most part, let's be honest, it's not going to be the indigenous communities or the marginalized communities or the Syrian refugees that are watching VR. This is something that's going to be consumed in places like this and by people like us with privilege, and we are kind of selling stuff, like actual stuff, and then ideals and ideas about the world. And so I think that, yeah, it's really important when we're kind of thinking about these things and thinking about POV that representation is really kind of considered. But I know we were kind of in the last panel, there was like some really interesting conversation about access, and I think these are just, about internet and all these things, because I certainly know where I come from, that even getting access to internet's difficult, let alone, something like VR.
I'm just wondering if we can open it up to the audience.
Yeah. Anytime, guys. Yeah. Éloi.
Well, about POV, I think we've been talking a lot about POV about who's in the center of the experience, but I think in POV, when I go see a movie, when I go see an art exhibition, I want to see the voice of the artist. I want to see the style. And right now in VR, I feel that more or less everything is the same. So is there room in VR for style, for POV,
absolutely.
and how is that coming out?
Yes, please. I think it's about the context. Again, I think us as creators, we can create the context where those stories can be told. And I'm not saying we are not legitimate story. Our stories should not be told. I'm just very worried about the fetishes, like how we fetishize the other. In the beginning of all new tech, how it's easier to go to another place that is a super, how can I even say that, super exotic, and show something because it's going to blow people away before we start even having conversations about the power of our own medium or the ideas we want to sell. So I think that's my worry in this space of POV. But yes, I think we need more variety, more style. I think we need the contexts to be better placed. We were even having this conversation about how to onboard somebody into VR, but we'll talk about that later. But yes, please. That's why we need people to open up and take more chances right now, because another game where we shoot things with lasers that look like Tron, I don't need that. And that's the majority of things that are out there for interactive media right now. commercially. And it's true, and it's awful. Sorry, I love Tron, but no.
It's okay. It's okay. But yeah, but like you mentioned like it's the bigger question is how do you make people care about the POV? Why should they go through the hassle of putting on the helmet and standing there and looking at the thing? It's like, wow, how do you make them care? Why should they go through this? And this is a way bigger question, because there are very, very big issues. But how do you make them compelling? Like not even in a positive way, but why should people care? That's a very important question.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question right here.
Yeah, I have a more technical question. You mentioned cameras in VR. I'm wondering, how do you write content? How do you direct content, considering the limitations of cameras in VR? In regards to movement in cameras and cuts and stuff like that.
You're talking about 360 specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that it's really kind of dependent on the content. It's something that it can change with every project. Obviously, kind of a narrative would be different than a documentary. A documentary is for the most part, you're going to have you kind of want it to be within action. And I think that it's still something that's not perfected, which is really fun. To say that I know, like, okay, this is how you do it would be, I think, kind of ridiculous of me to say, because it's not something that people have completely figured out. There's been some really great examples. Just here in Montreal with Felix and Paul, there was a great piece called Mayubi where you're in the place of a robot, and so the camera setup is just where people are just reacting to the camera as if it's like the robot. So you don't have to kind of like see the robot. You just know from where you are that you are this robot. So that they placed the camera low on the ground and had everybody reacting to it that way. And sometimes it's a fly on the wall, so it would be just beside the action. Sometimes it's I've seen people like with helmets that have the camera on top. This is kind of crazy, like a balancing thing, but it's so that it looks like the perspective of whoever is like wearing the camera. Also body suits, so it really is dependent on the project, and kind of what when it comes to like what point of view are you trying to represent. And actually, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
There were some more questions over here.
In fact,
or comments.
What you're putting there is that in VR we have the impression of being there, and as a person, as an actor. And the example that you're giving, we're the robot, but all the actors are reacting to us, and that's where there's a paradox, because the limitation Tali spoke about, we have a limitation in our agency. But at the same time, it's because we've got the feeling that we're here, we would like to interact or be recognized, or being recognized as being there, as being an actor in VR, is very, very powerful. In the example that you give, we're the robot, so we're recognized. But it's very hard to give us agency at the same time, so that the content would react to us. But in this particular, I would say, narration structure, we can have this this feeling that we're recognized. So that's for me, it's a super strong example that how can we frame the point of view as we are a person, because being considered by the content is one of the most powerful figure that I saw in VR.
I want to comment on that. That's exactly the research we're doing about taking you from doing things and making you being seen. Yeah. And I think that's one of the powerful research and try and error that we need to do. Like the gaze inside VR very powerful. I am not doing live action 360. I've been doing majorly like generated 3D and 2D inside VR. And that gives us a little edge of twisting things around a little bit. But I find that the human voice, the eye contact, the way the others react to your presence in VR is very powerful. And we need to explore that a little bit more. It's not there yet, definitely not there yet. But that the power of being seen when you're there, it's something I'm very interested in.
Yeah, there's, I would say, interactive structure, like thinking about Telltale games, that you're directly concerned by someone reacting to what you made as a choice, and even if it's not an interactive tree that is always bring back to bottlenecks, it's very direct to you. You're concerned by that. This kind of structure could work very well.
You're totally right, and the way VR has been changing a lot the way that game developers think about telling stories as well. We are also always making that play between the agency, how much agency we give away in the interaction to pass our point across and evolve a narrative and evolve the game the way you want it to play out, how much power, how much disempowerment we give. And with VR, that becomes way more exponential and more complex as well, because you don't only need to take care of the how delicate it is to give that feedback to the person that is reacting in VR to your choices. It's not just reacting to you, but also to your choices. It becomes a very big scope that we are not used to work with. So it's a very interesting challenge in the VR gaming world as well.
But at the same time, we've got great limitation, but also so simple tools like the gaze of the other, or even something as simple as proximity as a response is so
Absolutely,
efficient.
We have lovely mechanics, but it's to make it feel organic. That's the challenge.
I mean, sorry, just to interject and kind of as like buzzkill, but like it's really funny that what we're seeing is like these great achievements in these digital spaces when we're actually completely isolated is feeling not alone, like having like me see you and like connect, like this is like the goal is to actually create this, which is what we're actually depriving ourselves of because we're isolating ourselves into headsets. I don't know. There's just something to be said for that. No.
It's also good that you mentioned like the simplicity. Simplicity is really key to making a good experience there, because I see people like using super complex systems and trying to like tripping over all these systems they implemented. It's like, for example, you kind of go the Nintendo approach. You use a simple game mechanic that works, and you build around that. And because everything that evolves from that simple core idea of interactivity, everything adds to the rest of the experience. So keep it as simple as possible.
Like both of you were developing a game this week. How did you think about who the POV would be, and how, like, what were some of the processes and questions that you asked about how you were going to design this experience?
I think POV and game design is a little bit different. I mean, especially with a VR game. I mean, obviously, because if I'm a player just in on my PlayStation, it's like sometimes I can be from a perspective like Resident Evil or something like that, but then sometimes I'm just like a character that I'm seeing on the screen. For this, it was pretty just like, I don't think we even considered another option. It was just it is like a 2-player game, and you're each playing a character within this space. So we just I don't even think it was a conversation we had.
Well, one thing that I think was interesting about where we began was that most people talk about VR as a visual medium, and we've been talking about it as a visual medium, in this panel, but we were thinking about, okay, so what if we think about it as an oral medium? What if we think about it as primarily an oral and proprioceptive medium? And so we were thinking about this, how do you navigate this very dark space? And how do you navigate this dark space through sound? And Nyla had this idea that, okay, maybe if you make certain sounds, it illuminates the space in different ways. And maybe instead of a monster that you see, like what's scary in film is when you don't see the monster, right? So what if it's not something that you see, but it's a form of darkness itself? So trying to think about it as a audio space that we're inhabiting first and a visual space second. And
that's something that I think gets neglected a lot, is that kind of being in this space and is obviously not just a visual thing for any of us. It's and it's also like haptic cues, like people, the feeling of things and like the rumble of things, and we can kind of, it's not perfect, but we can certainly help create experiences that incorporate these components, and really thinking about sound in a way to help guide your perception of where you are, because that really is something that helps you really feel as if you're in a certain experience, place, the kind of tone.
I think it also relates to what Samara was just saying about, like, there's this, right? And so we were thinking about that, maybe not consciously, but a bit in this VR game, where the goal of it is for the two players to find each other. And when they find each other, like, this sounds cheesy, but like the space is illuminated.
And escape the monster, and kind of creating that feeling of depth when you're in a headset by using sound, and like knowing how far away things are from you, and when things are really close, you can almost feel like a whisper behind your neck or somebody, like, and it's all of course just through headphones, but feeling like someone's farther away or getting close to you quickly or slowly.
I think one of the most impressive things I saw this week in the workshops was how people started thinking VR more as a synesthetic experience. What I never experienced before in other kinds of workshop with traditional media. So everybody was like, okay, how does the sound translate in image? How does color translates in sound? How all those permutations that I do believe are a very good avenue for us to start understanding better the capacities of this medium. The use of sound, how we all embraced and like got Yannis Purhim was our only very like tech-savvy audio guy to like participate in all the projects, was a very good to see that we are starting to think those patterns, the way that we communicate in more than one sense. That was very interesting, and making those permutations were very interesting as well. I have a question from people at home, and it's for Nyla. They're saying, hey, I have a question. The technology of VR opens up a lot of questions of immersion in fantasy and in living in dreams. She mentions Ursula Le Guin. What are your dreams for VR on a more philosophical level, and what do you allow yourself to dream? Do you even allow yourself to dream?
Do I allow myself to dream? Yeah, I do. I don't know why this is for me specifically. Maybe we can.
Me neither. That's the power of public speaking.
No, of course. I think that's, and we kind of like when we introduce this is like kind of the excitement about what we're doing, and for me it is if I wasn't kind of imagining the possibilities of what we can do in the future, one, it's like would be a really kind of shitty medium to be working in, and secondly, it's it's exciting to be in a place where you don't have all the answers, and that there aren't any like hard and fast rules, and that you can really kind of stretch yourself outside of other forms of media, and to kind of it's as someone that I think like we all kind of come from different kind of backgrounds, and certainly I'd be very curious to, just from a technical background, about your ideas about tech and your dreams in the future. But as someone that just really likes exploring narrative, and is like we're talking about this game. This is something that was just like really kind of just developed on like wouldn't this be fun? But yeah, it's I think that it's really we're so early in the development of VR. It's only been a few years, and we still have so many technical restraints. In the previous panel, we're talking about just even the fact that we have headsets, and if that's going to be a thing in the future. And so kind of, which, that's kind of like a scary kind of path to go down. But I mean, it's also exciting about how we can, share perspective and imagine worlds that are kind of like mix of both what we can do in real life and the fantastical.
I think Anina had a question or comment.
We like Anina comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because we talked also about 360 and all the limitations, and that we can't have a frame, but actually just think about theater people, about a stage. They have, people are, well, there's all different new forms also, but you sit on a chair, there's the audience and there is the stage, and it's like, it's like the camera, the 360 camera, and you can tell lots of stories if you think VR is a stage, even with 360, even if you don't have all these interactive gadgets, because I think it's also an excuse sometimes when I get a pitch, so, well, no, I can't do that in VR, and it's, why do you don't work with, because we at Arte, we are privileged 360 videos for distribution reasons, because it's easier to get it out. So yeah, I don't know if there are theater people here in the audience, but there is a huge practice. And think of the Globe, Shakespeare. It's like it's there, and you can tell hundreds of stories. If you think VR 360 video is a stage of theater, so that's the comment I wanted to add to the limitations of the technology.
I was just talking like 2 months ago about with a person who's working in theater, and he was asking me like tons of questions. How can they make theater more exciting for VR? There's like a ton of industries coming to VR people and asking, hey, how can we make our thing work for VR? And I suggested to him like, okay, do Dante's Inferno, do it in VR. It's like I would love to make that. That would be super amazingly, even if you don't add interactivity into that, just going through every single circle, just following the journey. It's like there's, just like you said, VR as a stage alone, that's like, even that is super impactful.
Hi, I had a question, and I know this is a talk about storytelling, but what are your thoughts about abandoning storytelling?
That's abandoning storytelling, because it is interesting to bring up this idea of the stage, but like the idea of synesthesia is actually interesting because we are no longer constrained by the same like framework and this even just the same conventions that have accompanied us throughout history, So abandoning storytelling altogether. I know that I've seen people speak, and I tend to agree with them that VR is less of a device for storytelling and more it creates spaces, like it creates experiences. Maybe to go back to the Atwood quote, like I don't know, it is, although it's engineered, it actually begins at the story, it begins with a design, and then it bleeds into something that is potentially less story and more experience.
I think I use story maybe a little bit too generously because it can. But I think that when it comes to creating a piece of work, I'm guessing that it was made for a reason to either like make a statement or something. Even if you're not making anything about anything, then that's a statement in itself. And so I think that kind of when I'm talking about story, maybe it's not in the traditional kind of sense, but even the experiential stuff that I do, I think that I'm like, okay, maybe story is the wrong word to use, but it might be like, what's the experience that I'm trying to share and why, and how is that kind of like, how's that interpreted by people, and so I think that, yeah, there's just these experiences. For me, I think that, I think that's what you mean. I think the message is what I'm trying to convey, maybe more so than a story.
Yeah. Sorry. Go. Tess.
I was just going to ask what you mean by abandoning storytelling.
Yeah.
I think where I'm coming from really is with the idea of usurping power, the idea of constructing a narrative being talked to as a viewer in VR, but also in a sandbox situation where you're constrained by certain reactivities of the space. And I think that's something that maybe can be learned from very, you could say, aberrant behavior in video games, where people kind of figure out the system and they try to game the system.
Mm-hmm. But that's discourse too, right?
That is discourse, but my point is that that's not what the creator intended. So I guess, is there a space where we are creating a space for experiences that are beyond our expectations or are beyond our initial intentions as creators?
I don't think we are because of ego. I think we want to control the narratives we are putting out there, and I think it's very uncomfortable when it starts being broken down and repurposed, and I think that's one of the beauties of it. I think Eloi wants to disagree with me in a second. I see storytelling when we are talking story, when Naila is trying to define what story is for her. For me, story is discourse, is what is the subject or what is the context you want somebody to experience. And I think VR is way broader than a framed traditional movie or even a video game. I think breaking those laws is what I'm expecting. This is my dream of VR, of us creators giving more of our context and seeing what comes back to us as the user experience will transform our work. That's what I'm very interested in a personal level, and that's my artistic dream for VR. But I think that's a long way to go. I think we need to let go a lot, and it's a hard thing to do. We've been very powerful as storytellers. We're being very powerful as being in that power position of saying, you're going to sit there and you're going to listen to me, and you might have an opinion, but you experienced what I wanted to tell you. Right.
I guess I'm just going to put this last point in. But what a lot of the talk made me think of is things like Second Life, where things just got really crazy, right? And I see that potential happening to VR once we have a platform where people in VR can interact a little bit more. And this is something that Facebook is pushing in their own platform, in Oculus and so forth. Like, they see that going in that direction. And I think, and with all the stuff that's happening on Facebook, there's a natural discussion about power, of authority and sovereignty, and things about that in a virtual space. So, I think maybe there's something to be, there's some responsibility for creators to consider that in their work, and maybe think about how what we do can play into that somehow in the soft spaces.
Responsibility in our content is a big thing, and how we can at least have those thoughts and have that in our pipeline and our planning and the way we make our content is very important. I'm with you 100%. I just think it's very hard to predict all user cases. And that's, as a game maker, I can promise you somebody will always break something. People are very ingenious of breaking and doing bad stuff. That's true.
I think there's when you mention Second Life and stuff like that, I mean, there are places in VR where you can go and engage with other people with avatars and create things and that sort of thing. Is that what you kind of are referring to?
I guess I'm talking about, is there a place where social VR becomes a form of storytelling? Like, we're living these stories, and there is a means of creation around it, right? Somebody had to create that situation, but the story just becomes its own thing, and it becomes a generative story.
Anna.
You want to respond to that, Anna? Oh, we totally blocked Eloa.
My comment was about social VR, so that's where I was getting from.
Okay. Well, actually, I think it's sort of in keeping with what you're saying, whoever was saying it. Oh, there you are. Which is really related to stories we can't sell, and stories we'll never be able to sell, and stories that we think we're selling now but won't sell later. And it really has to do with this idea that interactive storytelling is a super niche product that's been trying to find a market for a very, very long time. And it's also similar in VR, I think. I think we have this idea that somehow perhaps VR will be that market and that channel that will finally sell interactive stories, where people have a certain amount of agency in the stories that they experience. But I'm not sure that will actually materialize. So if I'm being cynical and thinking that there's no market for interactive stories, period, okay, because it's a niche space, then the question that you're asking is really the important question, which is how can we turn those markets that we know exist in digital network media, which are the social spaces, so that there are more spaces for more meaningful connection and storytelling. And so it's about like actually taking that idea of, do we want Facebook to create Oculus spaces, or do we want artists to create Oculus spaces where meaningful connection can happen?
That's my
and also where potentially the money will be flowing into if we look at what's happened on the web. And I don't really know what the answer is.
Well,
I'd love to know.
Facebook will just steal all the good ideas that we have anyway, so.
Now with the recent like Oculus update, you can like implement your own 3D models basically right now. It's like super new feature. Like you already can customize your own virtual space, and there's of course places like VR Chat where like you can create your own virtual world, upload it, and meet your friends there, or just rip a 3D model from a video game and insert that and like walk around the Pokemon overworld or something like that. So it's already
That's for me
happening.
and my
Yeah,
really
but
cool
is that
friends.
meaningful? So that's the thing. When does that become meaningful? Are we not the ones responsible to at least try to provide people with a meaningful setting so those things can happen? I think that's what like it ties to what Anna was saying, and we are so tied up in when VR is going to pick up. When we are going to be mainstream and we can sell the most we can and see how far interactive storytelling or experiences can go, but we are not really thinking of how much we should study and practice our medium to the moment that actually happens. We have something worthy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like everyone working right now in virtual reality is like waiting for that moment. We're all like, we can't wait for that to happen. But it's like kind of like a toddler. A toddler doesn't just sit there thinking for 30 years. Okay, walking. How does that work? It's like okay, one leg there. No, it just stands up sometime and then it just do it, and then the other stuff comes like tags and stuff like that. But the toddler just does his thing and then looks for the rest.
Are you calling me a toddler?
No.
Eloa, what you were saying?
Oh, I was going to talk about social VR, and I think one of the big thing would be if artists could eventually just start their own VR gallery in a way, maybe through web VR, and start just expressing themselves and as freely as possible. I think that would probably turn into eventually something meaningful. If I can just create my own space is one thing, but usually inside Facebook or Oculus, it's going to be defined. The rules are going to be pretty clear. It's going to be, but if through web VR, we could do that freely and just experiment and visit other people's place like that, it might turn into something interesting.
Are you talking something more Minecrafty in a sense?
No, because already you have rules and structure. I'm talking about just people coding and just creating space that are completely insane, crazy, interesting, and fun to visit, and that are really reflecting the personality of the creator.
I'm actually
Like
excited to live in
sandbox.
that world. Yes.
No, never mind.
I mean, I have like this cynicism. I don't really want to abuse that right now.
No, do it.
I mean, I just wanted to like go back to the stories we sell kind of idea and who we're selling to. It's kind of a tangent from where we were, but it's looping back to where we kind of started off. This idea of the POV, the person who's in VR. What are we selling to them? Like, what do they want to accomplish in VR? I feel like there's at this point probably a pretty homogenous archetype. Like, if we were to do a market study, like market research in terms of like who the client is, like let's call him like George, like. He's pretty homogenous. Like we know what he wants. He wants to feel like excited. He wants to feel like he's exploring kind of the new frontiers of what is possible. He maybe wants to feel some kind of like he's like a liberal-minded kind of middle-class guy who wants to kind of access something that makes him kind of feel like he has been informed. He has maybe accessed kind of a new understanding of a situation that he didn't know much about, and is he kind of buying some kind of like righteousness through VR? Like, are we selling like back to this idea of the empathy machine? Like, what is being sold? Do we get to purchase kind of this ability to absolve ourselves from a wider conversation, or even purchase the semblance of understanding of something that's much more complicated? Like, is VR reducing our scope of like our capacity for engaging? Is it like, is the act of engineering an experience and prescribing what will happen, restricting like this prescriptive come A to B experience that is often the case in a lot of VR that intersects with documentary, is actually disengaging us from our instinctual ability to have real empathy and like real understanding, because we're kind of just snapping into this kind of quick fix. I don't know. Those are my thoughts. Do you guys want to respond to
That
any
sounded
of that?
great.
I don't know. 5 minutes left, so maybe a few more questions, or did I just like put a
It's hard to
damper?
put all VR in the same box.
Exactly.
What we experience here in the Phi Center, for example, if you guys saw, is very different for what you can consume on Steam, on Oculus right now. It's not necessarily the same pool, not necessarily the same access. So I think we have one, in terms of numbers, of course, who is buying commercial VR at home, like wants a certain sense of empowerment, of fun, of pushing, enhancing their experience is always the next big toy that will make their experience more exciting, make people feel things in society, even if it's fear, like horror VR is a big thing for consumers. Then when we go into more experiential things, when people are trying to make discourse and try to provoke thought, it's a very different loop. There are very different intentions in those body of works. And I'm saying that because I've done both. And we not even think those projects the same way. One is to create that sense of I'm the whole powerful, and things that we do with video games all the time, and that works, right? We all like to feel like that. While we have other body of work that is trying there to provoke and to think upon itself and be way more meta, like trying to study how far it can go. So it's hard to put it all in the same.
Yeah. No, one question I have is like, how do you insert things like irony, parody, criticality, reflexivity into an experiential medium? Right? And some of that just comes from our brains. Like when I go into a VR setting, I'm mostly just seeing the technology and the aesthetic and the genre, and like I'm not experiencing it, but that has to do with like the way that I just experience the world. I'm like, oh, what is that? What is this technology? Oh, look at what they're doing. Like I don't have any immersion at all. Like it's just, but you know, like how do you work, you know, things like that into an experiential medium?
Maybe Vlad, because you probably, of everyone I know, have spent the most time in VR. Like how has your relationship to VR changed? Is that something that you can even talk about? Like how is the medium, once you're past the novelty of being aware of the technology, like I don't know, has all this time you spent in VR
think
changed?
she bypassed the gimmick.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you spend hours every day in VR, right?
Absolutely, yeah. But yeah, it's like the most important thing I think is like just creating the frame, not in a frame like this frame, but like the context for things like that, concepts like poetry and empathy, to create the context where concepts like this can naturally happen and not be forced upon the player.
What's it like when you take the headset off at the end of each day?
It's like less colorful,
yeah,
and less sweaty.
I'm so curious to watch you work. Yes, in the back.
It seems to me that since we've talked about taking an empathy experience and assuming that we understand a more complex situation and going through comedy and horror and critic, it's like we're all talking about Get Out in VR. So the part where you don't have agency anymore, but you only have the look of the other person, and also the part where you have a critique of how do you take it. That it seems to me that we're all talking about what this would be, and this would have a look on. Are you taking assuming that you got it, and is it just a layer? But just the part about questioning yourself, I think that the risk that you take it at someone that a complex problematic that you understand is, we can't avoid this risk.
We cannot avoid this risk. Making VR is extremely humbling, I find. We had to define everything and the assumptions we had since the beginning. And I think that's actually very powerful. I think we are living in a moment where we can rethink, redefine, and try new things. And I think that's especially very fruitful for creators right now. It's where we have the space to have this conversation. It's everything so undefined that we can put more thought on it. Maybe we'll be very potent empathy machine. In some cases, maybe not. We need to try. We need to make things. We need to actually experience and see what works for our discourse and for the people that are consuming it.
I think we're going to end on that note. Be humble. Thank you so much, Nyla, Tess, Vlad, Tali. Thank you all. Please talk to us afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.